Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. It's Monday, September 13th, 2021, and by now, if you're watching the show or listening to it, I'm sure you already know there's a new national mandate via executive order that's coming our way in the very near future. So on this episode, I want to do my best to explore one of the questions we've been getting asked over and over and over, and that is, can the states nullify this? Can they take some kind of action on a state level and stop this mandate without relying on the federal government to limit its own power, whether that's through Congress or the executive branch or even the federal courts? Relying on the federal government to limit the powers of the federal government is not a great strategy at all. It hasn't played out very well. We live under the largest government in the history of the world, and of course now we have new executive orders and new mandates on the way, and it's only going to keep getting worse if we keep going that direction. But we have to take a look and see, well, how does this play out? So this is not necessarily a really polished episode because I'm just exploring this. So what I really want to do is I want to walk you through the process that I go through to start out when someone asks, can this be done? Years ago, when people asked me, hey, Bolden, what are we going to do about this NSA surveillance? Can the states do anything about it? I immediately said, no way, not a chance. But I had enough people asking me that I looked into it. And as I learned over doing a bunch of research over a period of weeks, I found an Achilles heel from the NSA. They rely on resources provided by states and localities like water to supply the cooling system in Utah, millions of gallons in order to keep it running. And so therefore, if the state doesn't provide that, then the NSA can't operate the facility. So the question that I'm really trying to answer here is not, will the people of the several states nullify these mandates? But can they? So we have to understand what they are, how they're going to be implemented, how it gets enforced. And I think you might be surprised. I've got some really interesting numbers from OSHA on enforcement. I think you might be surprised how much the federal government relies on the states to actually take care of this. So if you want the short version, I think it's possible. It's maybe. The question of will it happen, will people have the fortitude, is probably left for another episode. But I've got a lot of interesting info. We'll get some stuff from James Madison, from the White House website, from the Anti-commandeering doctrine, all kinds of strategy, and of course, information from OSHA as well. But first of all, before getting to that, my name is Michael Bolden. We broadcast live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. Our show homepage is everything you need to follow this program, all the archives, all the individual episodes. I include a bunch of links and references so you can read and learn more on your own time. I've got a lot of information here today, and I'm really just going to be scratching the surface. So I hope as a community, we can really look at the ideas that I'm sharing and then build upon this, and then hopefully someone can take it and run with it and make something happen, because I haven't been able to get there myself, and it really is going to take a lot of people taking a lot of actions to stand for the Constitution and liberty in the face of this great threat. So I'll have all those links in the show notes at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. You can also find all the platforms we're on and even our membership program. But let's get right to this, and I'll get to that information a little bit more in just a moment. I want to start out quickly here with a quick note from James Madison, writing in Federalist 47. And here he is citing Montesquieu, where he says, quote, this is a great maxim in government, in liberty, that James Madison says. He says, there can be no liberty, none, where the legislative and executive powers are united in the same person or body of magistrates. So the founding system was made, the founders generated a system to keep those separate. That's what they talked to us about. James Madison reaffirmed this in Federalist 47. So if the executive branch is having the same power as the legislative branch and it's all united, there is no liberty. And we see this playing out over and over. This is not the first time. What happened last week and what's coming our way is certainly not the first time. It's been ignored for very, very long, for many, many years, and it's only going to keep getting worse. But I wanted to remind people of that important thing. So let's take a look over at the White House, whitehouse.gov. Here's a quick overview of what's coming. The Department of Labor's Occupational Safety and Health Administration, that's OSHA, they write, is developing a rule that will require all employers with 100 or more employees, not 100 or more in one location, but 100 or more, not 100 or more working from the office, not 100 or more that don't work from home. So, for example, we'll see how this plays out. Could you have 100 employees, they all work from home, still fit under this mandate? Under this language, certainly, but we haven't seen the final rules yet. 100 or more employees to ensure their workforce is fully vaccinated, or require any workers who remain unvaccinated to produce a negative test result on at least a weekly basis before coming back to work. OSHA will issue an ETS. This is an emergency temporary standard. This is something where they basically bypass the normal rulemaking process. Side note, I don't think OSHA, as a general rule, is constitutional and shouldn't exist really. So we're avoiding that. We're just kind of looking at the status quo, how they're going to implement the legal authority that they're going to use, because we have to live in reality and see how we can basically battle that off. But OSHA is going to issue this emergency temporary standard. So when they normally issue a rule, it goes through a comment basis, a feedback basis. It can take months and months, I think up to 6 months. And this is basically a way that they say this is a grave danger. It has to be implemented right now, and then in the coming months, we'll come up with a formalized final process that goes through the regular system. They say at the White House, this requirement will impact over 80 million workers in private sector businesses with 100 plus employees. And most people are, of course, are paying attention to this part of it because it's so many people. It's 80 plus million. I've seen as high as 100 million people that this is going to impact. But there's also another order. There's multiple orders coming out of this single one that is going to affect around 2.5 million people, requiring a vaccination for federal employees and then contractors providing services to the federal government. And they don't even get a testing opt-out option. So on the private employers, you can either get vaccinated, you get the jab, or you get to get a test. For the other mandate of 2.5 million people, no option for a test at all. And then there's another 17 million healthcare workers at Medicare and Medicaid participating hospitals that I believe will also not be able to get an opt-out. Here, one quick note from Ilya Somin over at Volok Conspiracy at Reason, and he's talking about Medicare and Medicaid, on how they're basically what they're doing is they're implementing a new requirement to receive the funding or to participate in the program that maybe wasn't there in the first place. Here's how he put it. Supreme Court precedent requires that spending conditions be unambiguously stated in the authorizing statute. So the statute that created the act that authorizes them to enter into these deals with the states, it has to be unambiguously stated what their requirements are. And so if they go outside of those, then they don't get the funding or they don't get to participate in the program. And they can't just willy-nilly from administration to administration just add new conditions to say, well, now you also have to abide by this. We often hear from people that if the states get out of line, the feds are just going to yank federal funding. And that the Trump administration tried to do this in regards to immigration sanctuary cities and got just smoked in court. It just absolutely got destroyed over and over and over. And Soman points this out as well. He said the Trump administration repeatedly ran afoul of this requirement in its efforts to pull federal funds from sanctuary cities, because at least under Supreme Court precedent, whether we like what the Supreme Court has done or not, the status quo says if you try to add a new condition to something that they've already agreed to, you can't do it. We're going to strike that down. So the Trump administration lost over and over trying to say, now you have to do this or you're going to lose funds for these unrelated items as well. And here Ilya says, before offering a considered judgment, I would like to know more about what the statutes the administration plans to cite as authorization for this particular mandate. We don't really know exactly what they're going to do or how it's going to play out. Here also from Volok Conspiracy Reason from Jonathan Adler. And I don't think, I'm going to link to these, but I don't think you're necessarily going to agree with either of these two gentlemen as far as their goals, what their political affiliations may hit, but they've got some very good legal insight. And Adler puts it this way. He says, we do not have the details of the OSHA rule, at least as of when I put my notes together. Things move fast on this type of thing, especially when it's an emergency. And we've been posting over at TAC's social channels over and over lately. Emergencies are temporary, but precedent is forever. not the emergency power, but what they claim is going to be an emergency. That doesn't last forever. But they always use this. Fear is the foundation of government power. And so they want to scare people. They tell people there's an emergency from people overseas, so therefore we need temporary powers to deal with the terrorists. We need a TSA screening system, and then the TSA spawns another company called Clear, and now Clear today partners with Open Table to check vaccine passports to go to restaurants. So the idea that every time you give them a power to do something because you're scared of something today, you got to think how it's going to play out in the long run. So even those of you who may like this temporary ETS, this emergency standard that they're going to issue because of the political goal, you also have to think, what might someone in the future do with this type of authority? Unilateral executive authority, where James Madison, citing Montesquieu, said, if you can legislate from the executive branch, there can be no liberty. Not some. There's not going to just be very little liberty, but Madison himself said there can be none at all. Back to Jonathan Adler, he says, while this is unquestionably an aggressive use of OSHA authority, it does not represent a dramatic departure from the sorts of things OSHA has done over the past 50 years. And we have to keep that in mind. Read that full article if you want to understand what he's getting at there. But the point is that OSHA does stuff like this. And maybe he's not saying this, but I am. Maybe we need to start paying attention to more of these agencies and the stuff that they do and the precedent that they're creating, because what might someone do when they get into office and there's an emergency and a lot of people are scared? They're going to get more and more aggressive. I think we shouldn't be surprised at these types of things. And one other thing I want to point out, this is what we tweeted over the weekend, or maybe it was last Friday, is this. If the years of compliance while waiting for the courts to stop Obamacare taught us anything, it's this. Waiting on federal judges to limit the power of the federal politicians is a really, really bad strategy. So although the articles from Soman and Adler are very interesting, if you want to get a good backgrounder of how the whole thing plays out and what the arguments are going to be, that's great, but it's mostly legal jousting, and we're not going to rely on the federal courts to do stuff that they just don't normally do. Here's Mike Meharry in an article we published last week. He said, during the run-up to the 2013 federal government shutdown, the National Governors Association made a startling admission. The federal government depends on the states to do pretty much everything it does. The federal government depends on the states to do almost everything it does. Maybe that doesn't have the impact to you that it does to me, but check this out. Here's what they sent out in a panic letter to congressional leadership, begging them to avoid that so-called shutdown. Side note, we know that those shutdowns are never real shutdowns. They don't shut down the military-industrial complex. They don't shut down the police state or the surveillance or the civil asset forfeiture. They shut down some parks, and we're supposed to think this is the end of the world. Anyways, they say states are partners with the federal government in implementing most federal programs. A lack of certainty at the federal level from a shutdown therefore translates directly into uncertainty and instability at the state level. Now, here's the dirty little secret. States are partners with the federal government on most federal programs, and guess what? Partnerships don't work too well when half the team quits. So this is just kind of a reverse of how we look at our strategy at the 10th Amendment Center and how to deal with federal programs on a state or a local level. That is, quit the partnership. Because if you're working together to implement or enforce a federal act or regulatory program, when half the team is gone, they can't get the job done. We've seen this play out over and over and over. Whether you think there's 100 or 700 immigration sanctuaries, the reason that people don't like them is because when localities simply say, we're not going to help the federal government enforce this, the federal government has an incredibly difficult time making it happen. They can't pull it off. And if you read the ERO reports, the Enforcement and Removal Operation reports from ICE every year, which I cover this on this show from time to time. They repeatedly, for a number of years now, cite those jurisdictions that don't participate, even in the most narrow way, in their enforcement plans as being a huge roadblock for being able to do more ERO acts, more enforcement and removal operations. The same happens with cannabis. Now, we have about 36 states telling the federal government, or basically just define it, people of the several states literally saying, we're going to do something, we're legalizing a behavior that you're saying that we can't. And the federal government has been overwhelmed for many years. They have no way of being able to enforce this. I often cite the ATF as well. They have about 5,100 employees, maybe 5,500, 5,000 for the whole country. A third of them are in administration. They can close somewhere around 10,000 cases per year. And if there were, 10, 11 million undocumented short-barreled shotguns in violation of the NFA, the National Firearms Act of 1934, there's zero chance that the federal government would be able to do anything about this. So the feds rely heavily on the states, and they use this carrot and stick approach. They say, here's all this money. Of course, the state politicians love that. It gives them power, but the states really are implementing most federal programs. Meharry goes a little further. He points out that a 2021, so we're looking 2013 National Governors Association, but there was actually a study from Pew Research just this year that did a report on surface transportation funding, and it reiterated this important point. Mike says, the paper is the first in a series on fiscal federalism in action. And in this report section, the authors make the same admission the National Governors Association made 8 years ago. Quote, the federal government and the states are partners in almost every major domestic policy area. Together, their dollars pay for health care, education, transportation, public safety, and many other programs important to the American public. Of course, Pew's going to sell this as all these programs, all these government programs are very important, and therefore we don't have enough funding, and the states need to get more grants, or the federal government needs to increase its funding. So they're taking it from that more progressive view that they want more of this garbage, but we can also get this gem out of it. We recognize that they are partnering, and if there can be some courage on a state level, opting out and doing something different than what the federal government wants them to do, we've seen this play out in huge ways on immigration and cannabis already today. We are starting to see it in places like Missouri and Arizona, a little bit of Montana on the right to keep and bear arms. We hope that spreads much further, certainly. Going further, Mike Meharry points out that Alexander Hamilton stumbled on this exact same truth, writing in Federalist number 16, and he put it this way: if the interposition of the state legislatures be necessary to give effect to a measure of the Union, they have only not to act or to act evasively, and the measure is defeated. Now, Hamilton, of course, like Pew Research, Hamilton was complaining about this. He didn't like the idea that all the states needed to do was just act evasively or do nothing to defeat a measure. And that's where we are today. This was at a time when the government was going to be absolutely tiny, unrecognizable in comparison to the largest government in the history of the world that we live under right now. And so if all the states have to do is just not participate or act evasively, then the measure can be defeated. We've already seen this play out. This is exactly what James Madison advised in Federalist number 46, a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union. Madison didn't advise how to defeat the federal government in Federalist 46. He gave us 4 steps. He did not say vote the bums out or sue the federal government in federal courts. No, he said the governors need to be very outspoken. People need to be out there protesting. States need to use legislative devices, and there needs to be a refusal to cooperate with officers of the Union. And he said if a number of states took the same approach, it would, quote, present obstructions the federal government would hardly be willing to encounter. Again, Federalist 46, at a time when the government was going to be tiny, not when the government like today relies on the states for implementation of most federal programs. I won't get any more detail on that, but I'm linking to an episode on James Madison, How to Defeat Federal Programs, in the show notes. And then one other important piece of information. This is surprisingly, this Madisonian approach in Federalist 46 has been surprisingly backed up by the Supreme Court in a series of 5 major cases dating from 1842 through 2018. It's called the Anti-commandeering Doctrine. And here the court has said over and over and over that the federal government cannot require the states to help implement or effectuate federal acts or regulatory programs. And in 2018, the most recent case, the majority opinion specifically said, even if the state is taking an approach that differs from federal law. So the federal government cannot require them to spend money, use personnel, or any other type of resources to help enforce or implement federal acts or regulatory programs. I will link to an episode covering the 5 major cases, anti-commandeering, the legal basis for refusing to cooperate. That's really, really important stuff for our foundation here. Now, the big question, of course, we have right now is, can this strategy, which we know already works on other stuff, which we know comes from the founders, from James Madison, which we know has already been supported by the Supreme Court in a bunch of major cases, can it have any impact on the upcoming mandate? So understanding how OSHA enforces these things and how much they rely on the states to do it for them is essential. And as I said right at the beginning, the amount that OSHA relies on the states is absolutely massive. It's actually a little bit more than I expected. I'm going to get to some important numbers and details on that in just a moment. But what we do know is that it's going to take a lot of people willing to take a stand for the Constitution and liberty, even if the government doesn't want them to. Here's how Samuel Adams put it in a letter that he wrote as Candidus in the Boston Gazette in 1771. This was basically the mouthpiece of the Sons of Liberty. Samuel Adams put it this way: the truth is, all might be free if they valued freedom and defended it as they ought. So we not only have to understand that an executive order mandating stuff on 80 to 100 million people is bad. We have to tell people that that's a problem. And if they think the goal of it today is good, we have to explain to them that maybe they don't want their political opponent to have that same power. Now, a lot of people just aren't going to be convinced because they're partisan hacks, so we don't waste our time. Move on to someone else. There's hundreds of millions of people to reach, so we want to reach as many people with that. But we also have to understand how to defend it. Now, the number one way that we reach and teach new people about this is through the financial support and the financial faith of our members. Our membership program starts out as just $2 a month over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. And before getting to the stats from OSHA that I think are so important for this discussion, I just want to say a quick hello and a shout out and a big thank you to just a handful of people who have subscribed as members of the 10th Amendment Center recently. There's Floyd in Texas, Mary in Colorado, Robert in New York, Kenneth in Missouri, Robin in Missouri. A lot of Missouri people lately. Missouri Liberty Alliance, I know, is doing some organizing in regards to this type of effort right now. So this is very important stuff, and we're grateful for their work there in Missouri. There's Don in Illinois. Thank you so much for your support. So let's look at OSHA. OSHA, this is so important because OSHA is the one that's issuing this rule. So OSHA's going to enforce. But how does OSHA do their enforcement? Here from the Tampa Bay Times, they're talking about OSHA regulations in regards to Florida, but they have some very good general information. They say about 2,000 OSHA workers regulate more than 7 million businesses nationwide. 2,000 employees for 7 million businesses. You heard what I was talking about in regards to the ATF. They have 5,100 employees. A third are in administration. So they have like 3,500 enforcement agents. Their 3,500 enforcement agents repeatedly gives them a capacity between 8,000 and 10,000 closed cases per year. So if there's 100,000 cases to close, then they're only getting 10%. If there's 1 million, they're getting 1%. So there's a kind of a 1-2 punch here. And not only do we have to understand freedom, we have to understand how to defend it, but we also have to understand that it's a numbers game too. I guess it's a 3-punch. We have to understand that it's a numbers game. They do not have the manpower, the person power, the resources to enforce all their acts or regulatory programs. They rely heavily on fear of getting busted. And of course, that's legitimate. No one wants to, people don't like risking their cozy, comfy lives. But as they're destroying the economy and destroying the purchasing power of the dollar through inflation worse and worse every single year, I've seen statistics that say the purchasing power since the creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913 has gone down somewhere over 95%. So as they keep doing this, People are becoming more and more upset because their lives aren't as comfortable as they should be. We're in a very advanced society, and yet government is holding us back at every single turn. Anyways, side notes there. OSHA has 2,000 workers for 7 million businesses. OSHA's leaders say the agency is understaffed and underfunded. I call that a positive, often citing a statistic that it would take 160 years to inspect every workplace in America once. 160 years. So in other words, OSHA does not have the impact that they want us to think they do. They're like a caged beast, just like every other federal agency. They will attack people and make it high profile. They'll bust people. They'll prosecute. They'll raid like they've done for years with the cannabis dispensaries. If you followed the marijuana legalization effort for over the years like I have, you would know what happened, which is it was bad under Bill Clinton. It got worse under George Bush. And although the propaganda wants us to think that Barack Obama, the so-called peace candidate, peace president, was good on this, he was actually worse than Bush and Clinton combined. And what they did, because they recognized they didn't have the person power to enforce federal prohibition against especially the Western states, which has really been defying them for a long time. And now we've seen it spread across the country. It's growing, pun intended. But what they would do is they would do a ton of raids in California. And then we'd start hearing things like, oh my God, they're going to shut it down. The federal government can do whatever they want. But then they run out of steam. And then they move to Montana. And they do a series of raids around the state of Montana. And then they run out of steam. And then they move everyone to Colorado. In fact, they moved everyone, all their enforcement effort to Colorado just about 6 weeks before their legalization went into effect, whatever, 2013 or whatever year that was, I forget. And they did the largest series of raids in Colorado history as a warning sign. And that didn't stop them either. So this is basically what they do. They'll lash out. A lot of people do get hurt. They get arrested. They lose their liberty. They lose their property. But when enough people say no to the federal government and enough states pass laws to help back those people up, there's not much the feds can do if we zoom out in the big picture. We're not going to get from despotism to liberty in a feather bed. That's how Thomas Jefferson put it. So 160 years it'll take OSHA to inspect every business in the country just one time. That's insane. Here's from Politico. There's a quote from Debbie Berkowitz, who is a former OSHA policy advisor, now with a group called NELP, National Employment Law Project. Here's how she put it. This was in 2019. The agency now has the lowest number of inspectors in its entire history. It's not that much lower. They want to make this a big partisan thing, which I'll get to in a moment. It will now take over 160 years for the agency to inspect every workplace under its jurisdiction just once. This, of course, she says, does not bode well for workers, but it does bode well for people who want to look at what OSHA is trying to do and defy them, to nullify them, to defeat them. Because if they can't do the inspections, well, I think it makes a lot of sense right there. Here from the AFL-CIO, not a group I cite very often, but they've got statistics. Of course, their goal is far different than mine, but this is really important stuff. As of fiscal year 2020, OSHA has 1,798 inspectors to inspect 10.1 million workplaces under the Occupational Safety and Health Act's jurisdiction. And here's where it gets even more interesting. OSHA, they say, has 1,800 inspectors, but they're not federal inspectors. There are 774 federal inspectors and 1,024 state inspectors. So actually, when they say partners, states are partners with the federal government on most federal program. In this one, it's almost the other way around. The federal government makes the rules. The federal government steals the money from everybody and divvies it out. But most of the work being done, not a huge majority, but a certain definitely more on a state level, 1,024 to 774. So even under those limited 1,800 numbers, 1,800 inspectors, it's still a pretty good majority are still being done on the state level. The number of OSHA inspectors, they say, is near its lowest number since the agency opened 50 years ago. There's one inspector for every 83,000 workers. And I saw a reporter actually tweet about this over the weekend as well. I wonder how OSHA is going to do this enforcement. Of course, I think the implication there was, well, we better beef up the funding for OSHA. But that actually, if that's what they're forced to do, then that is a serious roadblock for them, because we see how all these budget fights go, and the more that they're gridlocked, and even if it's just for partisan reasons, the better. The more layers, the more attack vectors there are, the more that you can slow down the process, the greater that you have a chance of success in nullifying something. So we have to look at the amount of inspectors they have. They say the number of, but as I said, they like to blame one side. And a lot of people, we've also got some tweets on this just in the last few days as well. Oh, this was intentional. The Trump administration was trying to destroy OSHA, trying to bring it down. And he did reduce numbers. So I will give him credit on that. I'm zero fan of that guy. I think he was terrible on the Constitution, but there was a reduction in the number of inspectors of OSHA under his administration, which I see as a positive. I don't see it as a positive that he did the most federal gun control enforcement in history year after year. That's obviously a huge negative, but this is a positive. But it wasn't much different in the time when Obama was in office. The number of OSHA inspectors' political reports fluctuated throughout that administration, Obama, rising to 1,059 from 2009 to 2011. Then it went down to 943. We don't hear the progressives telling us, the progressives who love executive mandates to enforce health requirements or vaccinations. They don't say, oh, well, Obama was gutting the agency from 1,059 to 943. Then it rose again to 952. Basically, I don't know, what's the number now? It's like somewhere around 800 or so. So it's not a huge difference. It's not as if the Obama numbers would have been anywhere close to reducing the 160-year statistic that it's going to take for them to enforce, or it just inspect every business just once. And here's how Peg Seminario, Director of Health and Safety at AFL-CIO, put it: this is a sign of erosion in OSHA's ability to inspect workplaces. They put it this way: in fiscal 2020, they had inspected 21,000 on the federal level, 21,000 businesses, and on a state level, they did 32,000 inspections. So total over the whole country, they did about 53,000. This was a pretty big drop in 2020 because of the pandemic, about 30% if we kind of do the numbers together and kind of mush it together. 35% reduction on a federal level, 24% reduction on a state level. Sorry for all the statistics. I know some people glaze over on that stuff, but we have to understand that. If we're talking about 7 million businesses or 80 million employees, 100 million employees, here's the number of inspections they've done on a year-to-year basis from OSHA.gov. Of course, I will link to this in the show notes. In 2014, it was 36,000. 2015, 35,000. 2016, 31,000. 32. 2017. So 2016, as the turnover from Obama to Trump, it was 32 and 32,000. Trump kept it the same at 32,000. And the inspections actually went up under Trump. Even though the number of inspectors went down, it went up to 30, almost 33,500, about the same as the average in the Obama year. So they like to make this everything's a partisan issue to supporters of the monster state. It's either you're on this side, you're good, this side, you're bad, and the other side says the exact opposite. But the fact of the matter is the amount of inspections on the federal level was about the same year in and year out, in the 30 some odd thousand. How many businesses need to be inspected if people are willing to defy? Much, much more than that. And now we know that there are 22 states, and I've got a map here from OSHA.gov, which I will link to in the show notes, which shows you all the states that have a state plan. Basically, federal OSHA regulators or inspectors do nothing in those states. This is 100% in the hands of the states: Alaska, Washington, Oregon, Hawaii, California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, Wyoming, Minnesota, Iowa, Illinois, Michigan, Indiana, Kentucky, Tennessee, South and North Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, New Jersey, Connecticut, Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, and New York. No, New Hampshire does not. The states that I did not mention are federal inspections. So there's federal offices for OSHA in those states. And in the states that I did mention, the 22, if I got them all, and plus Puerto Rico as well, those states, the state does all the OSHA work for the federal government. That's very interesting. So almost half the states are in charge of all OSHA inspections. Here from the Tennessee plan, They point out that, well, I guess this is what would happen if a state literally said, we're not going to do this anymore. They're going to tell us the feds are going to come in and take over. But the feds only have 2,000 employees or 774 inspectors. And they don't even have close to enough to handle the 28 states that they're doing already. So let's say Tennessee says we're no longer going to participate in this state OSHA program. I'm not sure they're going to have the courage to do that. We're going to hear arguments like, oh, well, at least if the states are doing it, then we can at least have some say in how it plays out. That is utter bullshit. There's no way. You're literally just acting as an agent for the empire. And if you think you can do it just a little bit less bad, just stop. The states should stop helping the federal government enforce their garbage on everything all the time. That's my view. But if this were to happen, they already put this on the link for the Tennessee plan on every other one. In the event that federal OSHA resumes enforcement in this state, those federal standards will be enforced. Federal OSHA also retains the authority to monitor the state plan under Section 18F of the OSHA Act. So states are not making it better by running the program for the federal government. States didn't make things better running healthcare exchanges for Obamacare. It's still a government program. And it's not better if the states violate our rights, if the states violate the Constitution, or if the states get federal funding to help violate our rights and the Constitution simultaneously, or the feds. But what we do know is if you kick the can over to the federal government, they don't have a lot of employees. I mean, they do, but they're doing so many things that they shouldn't be doing that they run low on employees for basically everything that they do. States are partners with the federal government on most federal programs. So what should be done? And again, like I said, this is not really a polished episode. This is me just kind of thinking out loud, walking you guys through the process of how I look at things when we look to create model legislation to nullify a federal program or take it on, to undermine it. So the first step would be to ban material support and resources for the implementation or effectuation of the federal mandate or whatever. It doesn't even have to be for OSHA. This could be for anything. That's step number one. It's banning material support or resources for the implementation or effectuation of whatever act or order we're talking about. This should absolutely be done in the 22 states. I'm certain it's not going to happen in Hawaii or here in California or in Oregon, but it could happen in a few of those other ones. Tennessee, for example, South Carolina, North Carolina, maybe Indiana. These are places where it could happen, but it should also happen in all the 28 states that don't have a state plan, that have already kicked it back to the federal government. Texas, Florida, I think Montana, Missouri, all these other states should absolutely pass legislation to ban material support or resources. The reason is, even if we don't think that there's a connection, what we found over the years in trying to ban material support or resources to federal surveillance programs or federal gun control programs, we found in state after state, heavily in places like Arkansas and Arizona and Missouri and Montana, all the various agencies that come out and say, oh, well, what about this program? We're partnering to help that federal agency on this. So this will help smoke out some of the process, the many layers of federal-state intertwinement that is out there. So that type of legislation needs to be introduced and passed in as many states as possible. The second step is we have to expect to get sued. There's going to be legal arguments that are going to be made. And just like, Trump kept losing on the sanctuary city statements, sanctuary city cases, well, there's going to be an argument that, well, under this ETS, this emergency thing, are workers really in grave danger? So they should just do it and see what happens. You got to just have some backbone and stop worrying about getting permission from the federal government to do the right thing. Because if we wait for government permission, it's not liberty, ever. And then the third step, it really is about the people. So it doesn't matter whether state help is going to be there or not. If states withdraw support for material support or resources for enforcement, it has no impact if everyone is complying. If everyone, all the businesses out there are just complying immediately with whatever the president says, whatever OSHA says, then it doesn't matter if states help enforce that or not, because there's no enforcement action to take. So really, the underlying thing here on this and everything from gun control to cannabis prohibition to everything in between is it's about compliance or a refusal to cooperate with officers of the union. If regulations are not resisted, ignored, or disobeyed, then there's no question about enforcement. There's nothing to enforce if people comply. And that's how John Dickinson, the penman of the American Revolution, put it in a broadside in November of 1765 in response to the Stamp Act. And he put it this way: if you comply with the act, you rivet perpetual chains upon your unhappy country. So as soon as you comply, you've given them the precedent to do more. There's no reason for them to withdraw something. Government isn't going to give up its own power on its own, and it's definitely not going to give up its own power if everyone just follows what it tells them to do. John Hancock, in a letter to his London agent Jonathan Bernard, around the same time that the Dickinson broadside came out, just weeks before the Stamp Act was going to go into effect, he summed up the spirit of the people of the day. I think it's a spirit that we need way more of today. He said this: the people of this country will never be made slaves of by a submission to the damned act. Well, I hope you guys found this interesting. It's a lot of information. It's kind of a thought process. I'm not 100% certain. The question is, can the states nullify the federal mandates? I think the answer is maybe, because we really don't know the layers of enforcement, how it all plays out. We don't know the agreements. We'd have to look at the agreements each state has with federal OSHA. How can they withdraw from that? How can they stop participating? Can they end that? I don't know. But at the end of the day, it really gets down to compliance or resistance. And Clay Kent over in the chat says, blind compliance equals slavery. Defending Father says, liberty or death, literally coming to an America near you. Tim Martin says, I'll be declining the jab. After all, identify as part of the control group. That's awesome. And this is really an important mentality. Liberty Revolutionary says it's 27 states that are calling out the feds right now. Most of those states, Liberty, are basically saying, we're going to see you in court. And again, let's look at the Obamacare situation. There's lawsuit after lawsuit after lawsuit. And we kept getting told by people on the right when we were saying, no. We had model legislation to nullify Obamacare. We still have it. No one uses it because we're told, we got to wait for the courts. Let's just see how this plays out. Oh, well, that didn't play out well. Now we need to get the Tea Party in. That didn't play out. Now we need the 2016 election. That didn't play out. So in general, the right is looking for permission or just looking to get their people in charge to tell us that we can be free. And we have to change that mentality to what John Hancock had to say, what John Dickinson and so many others. That is, if you continue to obey, you've set the precedent, and they're never, ever going to stop. And that's how Hancock put it. The people of this country will never be made slaves of by a submission to the damned act. The question still remains, can it be done? I think the answer is maybe. We'll see. But more importantly, will the people have the backbone required to make a difference? I'll look over in the chat a little bit later today and see if I can reply to some questions and comments. Of course, you can email me at team@10thamendmentcenter.com. If you like the work that we do, you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, smashing the like button, subscribing, leaving comments on all the video platforms. All that stuff helps trigger the algorithm and tells the platform to show the program to more people. Of course, our membership program over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members, where you can put your financial faith behind our work for as little as $2 a month. And I can't thank you enough for any consideration you can give to supporting our work. I hope you found this interesting. I hope you're learning as much as I'm learning as I'm going through this as well. I hope you had a great weekend, and I'll see you next time here on the Path to Liberty.